Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Monday Night Film Talk from the Westdale. I hope everybody can hear me and see me okay. I will be looking at the chat and answering any questions you might have or comments. Always appreciated as we talk about the film. As you know, besides this Monday Night Talk, we also have our film clubs. And if you're interested in joining one of our clubs, please go to our website, thewestdale.ca, and you can hear more about the various clubs organized by genres. And those are done in a Zoom meeting, so there's lots that you can participate and talk about and enjoy while the cinema is still closed. Tonight we're going to talk about The Searchers. Now, The Searchers was released in 1956 and has always been a bit of a controversial movie. Many people consider it one of the greatest films ever made. It certainly was a very, very influential movie, but there are, even at the time, and certainly now, there are a lot of people who look at the content, particularly the treatment of the Indians and the relationship between the settlers and the Indians, and it makes them feel very uncomfortable. And of course, it is a disturbing film, and it's about a disturbing character, Ethan, played by John Wayne. And I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about the film, not just from its cinematic perspectives, but also from its thematic perspectives, and share a little bit about the John Ford, of course, the director, and how and he came about to do this film, and what were the influences. Now, of course, again, this film to me is one of the greatest films ever, but I was fortunate enough to see it on a big screen. It was shot in Technicolor, Vista Vision, which is extraordinary, and I'm sure you can imagine what it'd be like to see this on a big screen, because some of the visuals, regardless of the story and regardless of the film, are just so incredibly powerful and almost overwhelming and in my mind, almost, mythological. And the setting of Monument Valley is so extraordinary that one could appreciate what a great piece of cinema this was. It was more than a movie. I like to call these kinds of films like Lawrence of Arabia cinema because they were designed for that all immersive kind of cinematic experience. And this film, of course, was based on a novel that was written in 1954, just a couple years before, and it's during this period of time in the late 1880s during the Texas Indian Wars, and it was somewhat based on some factual occurrences, and there were, of course, many times like in this movie where young children were abducted and raised by the Indians, and especially female ones, and there's some conversations about what this was based on and what different stories was based on, but at the end of the day, it was not terribly relevant. But of course, there are also stories about people like Ethan, a Civil War veteran who spent years looking for his abducted niece. And then, of course, there's a very interesting relationship with his adopted nephew, played by Jeffrey Hunter Martin. And that relationship, of course, is very key to this film. Again, this is considered one of the greatest, most influential films ever made. The AFI, is rated the greatest Western ever made. It's like number 12 in some of these organizations. One of the greatest movies ever made. Everyone from Spielberg and Scorsese and Paul Schrader, Wim Wenders. I don't know if you've ever seen Paris, Texas, which was won the Palme d'Or in 1984, was clearly heavily influenced by this film. George Lucas was clearly heavily influenced by this film. And I'll talk about some scenes that clearly are, done in homage to this film. David Lean, stole moments from this film for Lawrence of Arabia. And there's a reason why. It is one of these great pieces of art. And clearly, it I believe still deserves to be considered that way. If you remember, in fact, with Lucas, we'll talk about the actual scenes later. And in fact, other aspects of the film went down and became memorialized forever. You know, John Wayne, Ethan has this wonderful line. He always responds, "That'll be the day." Well, that was actually the inspiration that Buddy Holly wrote his song, "That'll Be the Day," when he saw the film in a theater in Lubbock, Texas. And, you know, this really speaks in many ways to a very important concept or revelation that came through John Ford's work. It's very specifically talked about in a later film we did, A Man Called Liberty Valance, where you know this idea that when legend becomes fact, print the legend. So you know, in this case, you know, when fiction becomes fact, print the fiction. So in this story, you know, I mean, maybe that was the first use of false news. But in this story, clearly we're seeing a story where the myth and the legend of these characters and what the background is that they're playing against is more than just, you know, facts. This is not a documentary. You know, this idea of captivity and the captivity narrative is quite popular. Oh, wait a second. Did someone have a problem? Hold on. Okay, I'm back. And someone had a problem with the video. Is the video back? Are you able to see me okay? If anyone could just respond to that. So, you know, again, this story really sits in context of the founding of America and an American mythology of the West and the frontier. And you know, I actually studied this a bit in university in American studies, and it's the concept that America was really built through regeneration through violence is sort of the basic concept, and obviously true. You know, if you look at American history, and you look at the way they performed genocide, basically on the you know the American Indians that they found there. It was all done with a very strong philosophical and emotional idea of what they were trying to accomplish and what America meant. And, you know, there was a really, and this goes back to Thomas Paine and many of you know, the early Americans and their idea of a city on a hill and this concept that somehow they were on a mission, you know, and that the old world, which had sort of you know, was struggling and had all this class warfare and social warfare, that they had this musician, an example. They were going to create this new, you know, this example of a new earth, you know, building a new heaven for people to come to. And the expression often used was manifest destiny, that there was this destiny that drove these settlers to expand across North America, and that there was something, you know, special, that there were special virtues of these people, and this idea that you know the West needed to be remade in this image of agrarian America, and that there was this irresistible destiny to accomplish this essential duty, and you see it reflected. In fact, at one point, I think it's the farmer Jorgensen, you know, talks about how someday this country will be a good place to live, even if it needs our bones to make it happen. I can't even imagine the motivation and the spirit and why these people would have come and settled in these desolate places and obviously enormous danger at any moment of being overrun and killed by the natives. But they came, and they were many of them were immigrants, like represented here, but many of them were just adventurers and people who didn't fit into society and struggled with you know the normal social norms, and they came out to this wild country and you know and it's an incredible story of what America accomplished, but it was a very violent and kind of the consequences of what they did were enormous, and basically again they really eliminated the local people and who lived here. And there was clearly a completely different concept of you know them being a different species, and you know it's not unlike, I guess, the Holocaust and, and the genocide against the Jews. There was a cultural, understanding that what they were doing was not only okay, but it actually was being done for a higher good. And that's not inaccurate. That was indeed the mentality. And as much as it's a very difficult thing for us to accept today, and difficult for us to almost believe about, civilization, and civilization came and did this. Um, in this movie, it's not presented necessarily as being good or evil. It's being presented as, yes, this is the way they thought. And as much as John Ford would be criticized, and people watching the film criticize the behavior, it's not, again, he's not trying to judge the behavior. He's simply saying that was it. So again, there's a lot of merit to saying the Indians weren't portrayed accurately or fairly in Westerns. But, remember also the Indian did welcome the white man. And he wasn't diplomatic. And he was treated completely unfairly. But this idea of racial prejudice in the West is real. In fact, it's basically what American society was built on, was racial tension and racial warfare, because of course there was also slavery and the blacks. When we talk about Europe, we talk about the differences of the social classes, and that was really where a lot of the tension and changes in society occurred between the royalty and the different levels of people and success in a social setting, while America is really a story of race, and it's a story of this white Caucasian race coming and obviously becoming successful on the back of slavery, and then ultimately taking this land from the people who owned it and lived here for thousands of years and turning it into something else, And it's tragic beyond words, but this movie did indeed represent the way people were thinking, And it's, obviously when it came out, everyone thought the shots were beautiful, but one of the reviewers says, at the center is a difficult question. The Wayne characters are racist without any apology, and so in less spoken ways are the other white characters. And is this film intended to endorse these attitudes or to dramatize and regret them? But in 1956, many people, really accepted this kind of harsh view of the Indians. I also have to remind you, as it was pointed out, that Ethan's revenge and desire to destroy were the Comanche. These were the people who had come and killed his brother and the brother's wife and the family, and had captured and ran off with these two girls. Revenge for that is understandable. It's specific to this tribe and tracking these people down. He's never expresses a disdain or hatred of just Indians in general. It's specific to these people and somewhat understandable, I would say. But nevertheless, it became mania. He becomes completely obsessed, right? And this whole almost, it's terrifying, right? His pathological concept of honor and sexual, racial, and as I said, he's a hero, but he's a hero with this obsession and mania, and even his companions are horror, almost baffled by this, especially Ward Bond as both the preacher and the Texas Ranger. That's a wonderful idea, and a true idea, that the leaders of the church were also the leaders of the society, and that was true for the Pilgrims as well. And if you think of the moment when Ethan shoots out the eyes of the dead Comanche, when they find this. That's right. He also kills he kills all the bisons because he wants to deprive the natives of food. He's clearly an obsessed guy. He shoots out the eyes of this dead Comanche, but because he knows that will blind the enemy from finding his way in paradise, right? But how does he even know to commit this atrocity? Is because he actually has spent time and understands Comanche beliefs, and and he sort of accepts them as reality, and that's their reality. So I wouldn't say it was, respectful that he did it. It was horrifying that he did it, but he did it in the context of actually understanding something about the natives and native life. The script is by Frank Nugent, who was a top film critic, and I think in some ways it does acknowledge the reality of these prejudices and the blind spots, but I'm not sure at any point the director's actually condoning them or saying that they are appropriate. So this was a real interesting time in our history, and really begs a lot of questions about the rule of law and the law of the jungle, and again, truth or legend. And again, we talk about the triumph of civilization over barbarism, but this was based on this lie, and that and underneath it, when you think about the procedures and high-minded institutions and the politics of the government that and the people who employed it, it was it's a legacy of bloodshed, and they're no more civilized or in any way humane than these sort of native people who they didn't even believe were human. I mean, they were some kind of other species. Um, Again, there is a shot at the end of the movie, because of course at the end of the movie Ethan does embrace his niece and does take her home. He doesn't kill her, and so there's a redemption in that story. There's a redemption in his action, but I don't know if people who've seen the movie for the first time saw that coming or expected it, but it's hard perhaps to accept that one shot can redeem a character for an entire film of all the other actions that he's taken during that time, right? And again, for Ford, he went on to make another film after this called Cheyenne Autumn. I believe it was in the early 60s. And he was, I don't know how to describe it, but he was very, all of Ford's Indian themed Westerns, he shows native characters being separate and apart from society, but it's not that he didn't have sympathetic images and tried in some way to represent a more fuller picture of what native life was, and both sides of this horrible conflict. But he was also, of course, a very commercial director, and he was very aware of his audience and what his audience's expectations and interests were. And so this idea of showing them, with dignity and a proud civilization, it was important to Ford. It really was. In fact, if you think about it, we don't really see on screen these Indians committing any atrocities that were actually that much worse than what the white men were doing. I know there's obviously actions, but he purposely doesn't show them on screen in a sense. We never do see that kind of violence from the Indians on screen. So, again, so many people comment on Ethan, this character that John Wayne portrays, and how extraordinary he is and representational of America, of American character, American beliefs. Remember also this was in 1956, and this was during a period of time where the war was over, and we had won, right? And now there was a time where there was a lot of disturbing things going on in our society, and there was, McCarthyism and all of that, and there was sort of a time where films were starting to explore a little the underbelly of this, American dream that, was obviously, again, not necessarily dreamlike for everybody. And another wonderful quote about the film and about is that was comparing Ethan to Ahab from Moby Dick. He's the good American hero driving himself past all known limits and into madness. His commitment to honor and decency burned down to a core of vengeance. I thought that was kind of a wonderful description. But at the same time, when we finally get to meet Scar, and Scar, why is Scar doing what he, well, it's, Scar's cruelty is also motivated by revenge. He says two sons killed by white men. And, for each son, I take many, many, scalps. This theme, is right there from the beginning. Early on, when we find out Martin is 1/8 Cherokee, Ethan calls him a blanket head, and that he immediately, once he knows that Debbie's been captured, he'll kill his niece rather than have her living with a buck, living with the Comanche ain't living, um, and then he even tells Laurie, the love interest for Martin. Martin says Ethan will put a bullet in her brain, and I tell you, Martha would want him to. That comes from Laurie, right? So it wasn't just Ethan who has this kind of obsession and great interest in this, but. It's this, again, there's no rape shown in this, but this was the greatest challenge and fear for Western man, and part of this myth. And of course it was so interesting during that scene. He has to go down this narrow crevice in the rocks, and he stabs his sword, and it's a lot of kind of sexual imagery here. And but what he's found is is the older sister, and she's been raped and killed, and he doesn't have his coat anymore, right? Because he used his great coat to bury the body, and so this was real. It was a fact of life, and there were captives, and there were captives who escaped and who were raped and were ransomed back to the white world. I mean, again, this is such a different world than the one we live in today, and this concept of violence and the action of the violence and the consequences to these characters is something that is a little hard to comprehend. We don't live in a life and death situation. We don't live where every night we go to sleep thinking that we could be attacked and our daughter's raped. And it's a very, very different thing, and very hard in a sense to get perspective on. I do want to talk about John Ford, of course, because regardless of this film, he made many, many, many great, great films. He's often considered one of the greatest masters of cinema history. He won a total of 6 Academy Awards, and he won 4 times for Best Director. There's no other director who's won more than 3 times except John Ford. He won for The Informer, he won for The Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, and The Quiet Man. And none of them were Westerns, even though he was mostly known as a great Western director. In fact, he won 2 years in a row with The Grapes of Wrath and How Green Was My Valley, and I don't think that's ever been done by anybody. And, and he was very intelligent, and erudite, and sensitive, and sentimental. But he really projected this whole culture within the cutthroat atmosphere of Hollywood, of being this kind of really tough, two-fisted, hard-drinking Irish kind of guy, and sometimes to protect himself from the studios and their involvement and everything else. There's a very famous story where a studio executive comes out to the set of Drums Along the Mohawk, a Henry Fonda movie, and he wants to complain to John Ford that that he was 3 days behind schedule. So John Ford takes out the script and he rips out a bunch of pages and throws them on the ground, and he says, "Nope, I'm back on schedule." He wasn't going to take a lot of shit from anybody. And in fact, he was also very well known for not shooting a lot of takes or shooting much coverage. He didn't do storyboards. He wasn't Alfred Hitchcock, right? But he could visualize this entire film in his head. And he would only shoot the shots he needed. He didn't want to have extra material. He didn't want to have alternative takes, because in the studio days, as a director, you didn't necessarily control the cut of the film. You had no final cut. This was the studio bosses, and you were involved perhaps with the editing, but they could do what they want with your footage. So he just wouldn't shoot any footage that he didn't want in the film. And so editing, I guess, was pretty easy, but this was his way of protecting himself, during that period. Of course, he started with silent films. He directed a film, God, he directed 62 films between 1917 and 1928. Some of these were shorts, but features as well. And his biggest film was called Iron Horse. This was a Western about the building of the railroads in 1924. And it became one of the top grossing films of the decade. But again, it's interesting to me, not unlike, Alfred Hitchcock, these are directors who started in the silent film era. So they learned to tell stories with visuals and music. There wasn't dialogue. There was no other way to communicate with the audience. And I think they really, by necessity, developed an understanding of the power of the visual image and how important all this was. And it's funny, he's often thought of as a guy who didn't really, work so well with actors, and he didn't give actors tons of direction. That's true. But he also discovered so many great actors. In fact, he put Spencer Tracy and Humphrey Bogart in their first movies. They were signed by Fox based on Ford's recommendation. In fact, he had over 12 actors win Academy Awards for Best Actor or Best Actress in movies that he directed. And that's not bad for a director who, didn't do much, didn't do, work well with actors. Um, the first big one, of course, was The Informer with Victor McLaglen, 1935. Stagecoach was, the first Western that he made, a talkie Western in many years. And this was the film that Orson Welles watched 40 times before, preparing for making Citizen Kane, another incredibly admired film. Also, what he did with his actors, he had a stock company of actors. So there were many actors who would appear in many of his films, not only the stars like John Wayne, Henry Fonda was in a lot of his, Jimmy Stewart, Vera Miles, who appears in this film, as Laurie also appeared. But there was these character actors, and Ben Johnson and Ward Bond as the preacher, and Mae Marsh, Harry Carey Jr. Harry Carey Sr. was a great Western star in 25 of Ford Silence films, but Harry Carey Jr., John Carradine, from Grapes of Wrath. It was like a whole troupe, and they were the John Ford Stock Company. And I think it was very interesting how he did this because it gave his audience a familiarity and kind of a recognition of these side characters that immediately kind of gave them a comfort level with the film and an understanding of what the film represented. And again, there were a lot of themes that were similar again and again in his movies. He had a very clear personal vision in his films, very consistent visual style. He barely moved the camera too much. Very, very composition was essential to him, and he really focused on composition. Though there were times, great tracking shots like when the Rangers finally attacked Scar's village, but a lot of it was done in a much more very controlled and sort of simple way, which was very appealing and somehow felt very American, versus some of the stylistic European directors. And of course, the characters were often loners, outsiders, and didn't talk a lot. They weren't big on dialogue. They were action characters, and he would explore these conflicts with society, and like Grapes of Wrath is a perfect example, right? So, and one of the things he did in this film that I thought was so extraordinary, and this happened later in his career, was the idea of bringing nature into the film. That this wasn't just a film about people. This is a film, where these people are, juxtaposed against these natural surroundings and these breathtaking long shots, right? And it's the movement of the men and horses. It's really incredible. It does evoke this, power and serenity, and then when you add the musical score, which often somehow has variations on folk themes and the songs they sing at the end, that was almost more important than the dialogue in Ford's films, like a silent movie. And we'll talk about the score a little bit later. And again, using these characters really, really made a big difference. So let's see, Ford had so many wonderful quotes about Yeah, he says, I don't give the actors a lot of, I don't give them a lot of film to play with. In fact, Eastman used to complain that I expose so little film. I do cut in the camera. Otherwise, if you give them a lot of film, the committee takes over and they start juggling scenes and taking this out and putting this in. They can't do it with my pictures. I cut in the camera and that's it. There's not a lot left. So he really, and again, huge commercial hits. How Green Is My Valley, 10 Academy Awards. Sergeant York was another favorite. He says, "Oh well, this was interesting. So this was right around this time with the House of Un-American Affairs, and one of the biggest supporters was Cecil B. DeMille. And Cecil B. DeMille was, even more right wing, I think, than John Ford was. But there was a big meeting, of the directors talking about this idea of blacklisting, and people were being called to volunteer names. And he gets up, he says, "My name's John Ford. I make Westerns. I don't think there's anyone in the room who knows more about what the public wants than Cecil B. DeMille. And he certainly knows how to give it to him." And looking at DeMille, who was in the room, "But I don't like you, CB. I don't like what you stand for, and I don't like what you've been saying here tonight." And this was, again, one of the most powerful, politically connected directors. Uh, Andrew Sarris, the famous film critic, his comment on Ford was, "He's a storyteller of the screen into, America's cinematic poet laureate." Ingmar Bergman considered Ford the best director in the world. Frank Capra referred to Ford as the king of directors. And Alfred Hitchcock was a huge fan, and even Kurosawa, very influenced by John Ford. I pay close attention to his productions, and I think I'm influenced by them. David Lean's inspiration, of course, you remember the famous scene when Ali, appears out of the desert, is directly, influenced by the scene of Ethan first appearing on the horizon, and we just wait and wait as he gets closer and closer. There's a brilliant Indian director, Satya Ray. His comment is, "A hallmark is never easy to describe, but the nearest description of Ford's would be a combination of strength and simplicity. The nearest equivalent I can think of is a musical one, middle period Beethoven." Jean Renoir's comment was, "I learned so much today watching The Informer. I learned how to not move the camera." And Orson Welles' comment was, when asked to name the directors who most appealed to him, he replied, "I like the old masters," by which I mean John Ford, John Ford, and John Ford. So, I've seen many, many, many of his movies, and regardless of how you might feel about some of the political aspects of this, I would highly recommend studying him because I can't think of anyone who is more influential. So this story itself, again, was based on a novel in 1954. The screenplay was written by his son-in-law, Frank Nugent. He wound up writing 10 of Ford's films, um, loosely based on real situations. But a couple of things in the book were even more obvious. Of course, there's a very important plot undercurrent is the attraction, the mutual attraction between Ethan and his brother's wife, Martha. I think that's pretty evident. And you can see without a lot of words. At one point, the brother says, "Oh, it took you time to leave." And it seems like he had been hanging around them for a while before the war. You can see the way she holds his coat and pats it, and all sorts of little visual references to their relationship. And some critics have suggested this unspoken passion may, in fact, mean that, Debbie, who's specifically described as 8 years old, and this is Ethan returning after 8 years, may indeed have been Ethan's daughter, not just his niece. So that would obviously, further layers of nuance to this obsessiveness for Debbie and his revulsion at the thought that she might be living with an Indian. And then, of course, his ultimate decision to. I have not read the book, but my understanding is that there are even more hints about all of this. And then, of course, you can't, all the crazy, psychology of a guilt-ridden father's need to save the daughter he made by, screwing his brother's wife and then abandoning them. I mean, that's pretty stark. And it is a Stark-only story, and a story of obsession. And Martin Scorsese and Paul Schrader were clearly influenced by this in Taxi Driver. And in fact, the villain Harvey Keitel is his name's Sport, and wears a Western hat, and the pimp was kind of like playing the chief. Um, and it's there. So with the book, the other incredibly different. The ending was completely different. So in the ending, Debbie does not go back with them, doesn't want to go back with them, nor does she want to stay with the Indians. She tries to escape, and she runs off into the desert by herself. And in fact, it's only Martin who finally finds her still alive, but starving, and brings her home. So that whole sequence at the end, where Ethan, finally catches up with her and raises her up in his arms and says, "I'm taking you home," wasn't in the book at all. So, the casting, well, John Wayne was going to play this role. They had made, I think, 24 films together. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. And Stagecoach, of course, was the film that really broke John Wayne through. And he really, Ford really shaped this whole screen image. Um, and at the very beginning, nobody wanted, John Wayne. He wasn't an actor. He was actually a football player at USC, and he kind of worked as a stuntman. But everybody, but people recognized right away he'll be the biggest star ever because he's sort of the perfect everyman. And I know that might sound odd now because we have this image of John Wayne so clearly in our brain as this kind of bigger than life character. But at the time when he was first starting, he was certainly different than the traditional movie star that was being promoted at the time. And the power of putting him in this film is very significant to me because, when you watch this movie, you know John Wayne, you know who he is and what he represents. And so, there's a whole mythology and story to this character that you as the audience are bringing to watching this film that the director didn't have to work for it. It was already there, right? So again, then playing him against type, because most of the time John Wayne was pretty, much heroic and very moral but to play this very kind of dark and obsessed character, I mean, this is clearly, a very compelling character. And regardless if you like him or not, he's a compelling character and very different than anything John Wayne ever did. And I think that really actually made a big difference in people's appreciation for the film because they were recognizing his performance, which I think is actually very, very good in this film, as being not his usual character. He was doing something quite different. Natalie Wood, of course, was actually very, very well known to the audience because she had started acting at the age of 4, and of course, at the age of 8, she was in, Miracle on 34th Street, and I think she had been in something like 15 films by the time she was 25. So she was a teenager, and I guess she was about 16 or 17 in this film. And actually, she had just finished Rebel Without a Cause and had won a Best Supporting Actress. So even though she had a very small role in this film, it was a very powerful role. And again, because when the audience sees Natalie Wood, they know Natalie Wood. This wasn't just some face, and they have all this emotional attachment to this star, Natalie Wood. So it immediately created all this empathy and feeling for her. So it was very, very calculated to put a movie star in that role. And she was a great actress. She had 3 Academy Award nominations by the time she was 25, right? And then of course, West Side Story, was such a great role. And then tragically, she died when she was 43, in this kind of mysterious circumstances. Jeffrey Hunter was actually, quite a well-known actor at the time. He was very handsome. He was sort of the perfect, matinee idol and had a lot of magnetism. But he was also a very serious guy and married and with kids and very polite and very athletic. And people really loved him. And also tragically died quite young. I think he was in his late 40s when he died. So one of the reasons we made in 42 when he died. So maybe, and John Fordham used him several more times, very effectively. So the production itself, of course, was mostly shot in Monument Valley, which was spectacular location and still is. And some was shot at the Chatsworth Ranch outside of Hollywood. And then, oddly enough, some of it was shot on sound stages, and you can see some very bizarre sequences, at a campfire, closer see where there's clearly, a scenic drop in the back, and I don't really understand how they made this decision about which scenes they needed to do on stage. Obviously, they did, the sets, for the for the interiors of the cabins, but very strange. And maybe in those days people were less critical, but you can see today, and some of them just don't make a whole lot of sense. Um, Obviously, the most famous shot is the opening shot, and then, of course, the last shot. And, it's that contrast. Here we are in a dim interior and the daylight outside. And then there's sort of a frame within a frame, right there, the posts on the porch. Then there's the door. And obviously, that's a frame inside of the frame of this screen. And then with the wide expanse of the screen, this was really powerful. And then we have this little tiny guy lingering out in the landscape, and he's coming from there into civilization and into the world, right? And everyone else, at the end goes inside, all the surviving characters, and they've gone through all this grief and violence and waiting and homecoming. But our hero, right, who his ruthlessness, his obsession, his abstinence, made it all. He's excluded. He's not able to come into the house, into civilization. It really, again, emphasizes his solitude, his separate. He's alienated, himself and from his society and everywhere. And there's something, very tragic, I think, and emotional as we watch him, walk off and not be able to participate. So again, incredible sequences. The scene, of course, that Lucas is most famous for stealing is when they come back and see the homestead burnt, and Debbie and her younger sister are missing. By the way, the young Debbie is actually played by Natalie Wood's sister, by Lana Wood, who also became an actress. If you notice similarity in the way they looked. But, if you think about Star Wars, the first Star Wars, there's that great scene where, Luke comes back and he sees, his family's, little outpost has been ravaged and destroyed. And it's very similar in terms of shot sequences as used, before. The mystery of who Ethan is, where'd he go for those 3 years? Was he in California? Did he fight in the Mexican War? It's very interesting because the medal that he gives Debbie is actually a Medal of Honor that's granted by the federal government, right? But he fought as a Confederate soldier. So he never would have been awarded the Medal of Honor. So obviously he did acquire that at some point, along with all those new gold pieces. You know how his brother comments on they look like they were freshly minted. And so there's this wonderful kind of mystery about him and where he was and what did he do during those years. And it seems to have brought some money together. Um, you know, anyhow, so much is going on. I see, in the subtext of all of this kind of stuff. And then, of course, they talk to him. Martin's always saying, "Do you want to quit?" And that'll be the day. And then he has that wonderful speech about, Injuns will quit, but Ethan's not going to quit. Ethan doesn't give up, but he's somehow, there's something about what the white man has that is beyond the kind of obsession or focus that any Indian would ever have. And there's some very poetic scenes, where it's hard to believe I'm listening to John Wayne when he's, standing there talking about the search and says something like, "Sure as the turning of the earth, I will be, will be looking next year." Very strange structural part of the film with the letter, right? Like Laurie gets this letter from Martin. And I'm sure it was conceived of in the screenplay as a way of sort of shorthanding, telling a bunch of their adventures along the way, including Martin marrying the Indian woman. But it's a very strange construction where we sort of jump back and forth, and there's this letter, and then we see these scenes, and sometimes I feel like there's almost two stories going on here. There's sort of our core story, which is, Debbie's capture and the search to find him. And then we sort of have this funny little, civilization story, and, the Martin Polly Laurie love story, I don't know where that came from, and an excuse for them to, have a dance and sort of show, the community and the civilization and sing a song. And these are all characteristics of all these John Ford movies. But, for me, that was not the most interesting part of the film. And I think maybe that's also part that gets in the way for some audiences. And I just think for some of these great directors, maybe they just kind of ignore that as if it's recognizing for what it is, and that this isn't really, what was, important for him. So again, what do we see? So many scenes with these bustling, busy interiors full of life and motion, and then the contrast of these, human figure, alone or in small, vulnerable groups against this vast, obliterating landscape. It's kind of incredible the way he can take these two different realms of experience, the domestic life and the wild and natural life, and but at the same time, he's sort of acknowledging that these, it's hard to exist in both these worlds. And Ethan, in a sense, has made a choice. He's choosing to not be part of this civilized life and civilized world. And that threshold of the door at the end is something that he can't cross, and he will forever, kind of live in this other world. The music, I mean, is just, well, it's Max Steiner. So Max Steiner was sort of the Warner Brothers contract composer, and really was one of the people who first started the tradition of writing music for films back even in the silent days, and mentored many of the great composers who followed him, and Dmitri Tiomkin and friends, Alfred Newman, even Bernard Herrmann. He was nominated for 24 Academy Awards, and he won 3. He won for The Informer, which was a John Ford movie in '35, now Voyager, and Since You Went Away. So again, the reception of the film was, mixed. It was not his most commercial film, John Ford's most commercial film. It's clearly a film that has developed its reputation and its love over time. It really, was different, and people didn't quite know what to make of it. And this revenge story, and again seeing Ethan, John Wayne in a different role. One comment that I read somewhere is that part of this also is the story of because it never gets said, nothing really gets explained. But here's Ethan. He's a soldier, right? And he made a commitment, and he fought on the side of the Confederacy, and he lost. And in fact, they comment on it, I haven't seen you since the surrender. And he says, you didn't see me. I wasn't there at the surrender. Because he wasn't going to surrender. He's going to be this iconoclastic individual. But now he's a guy without a cause, right? And maybe he's a guy who is constantly in search of a cause. What can he care about? What can he fight for? He's not going to get married and live a normal life. He doesn't want to be part of the army anymore or join the Texas Rangers. In fact, when they tell him he's joining the Texas Rangers, he says, no, I'm not. I'll come with you, but I'm not going to become a Texas Ranger. So when this niece or slash daughter gets kidnapped, it does mean a lot to him. And he wants revenge, and he hates, the Comanche and Scar for killing his brother and his family. But maybe it's important to him personally because now he has a cause, And he's searching for something more than just finding, the girl, but he's searching for some kind of meaning or peace of mind in his life. And the lyrics of the closing song almost speak about that, because he will keep searching, and he'll keep riding, away again, and he'll keep searching for that peace of mind. And maybe he'll find another cause, and so it's very interesting because now that cause has been fulfilled. He still doesn't have peace of mind, and so he has to continue his search and walk off, right? So I don't know. I don't really think this is a movie about racist attitudes towards Indians, but I think this is a much deeper film that is trying to get at the root of what happens to men like Ethan, men who are, violent men, men who are in war, and how can they and how they can survive. And again, it's so hard to appreciate that one shot, where he decides, and he shows his love and tenderness to Debbie, and I think we all understand it. Again, is it that it's redeeming him? I don't know that he needs to be redeemed. I think he's not searching for redemption. That's not the peace of mind he's looking for, because of course he doesn't find it. But it does come from it does. I think for the audience is very emotionally satisfying. Obviously, that everyone could be together, at the end. But for him, I think he's just so full of hate and brutality, and he's just consumed, and again, even before this event and the kidnap, we don't know what he's been through and what he's experienced, but his in that moment, it's a very true to life moment, I think, and done very simplistically. It's not done with a lot of big fanfare. So anyhow, for me, this meant so much sense, and so much a reason why, I kind of love this character, and I love the complexity of the character, and what he represents, and I think John Ford did an absolutely extraordinary job, creating this film, and it's very different than most of the westerns that he ever made, and they're all wonderful, and they're all very lyrical and beautiful, and incredibly well shot and performed, and the action is just amazing to me, but this film really got to a different place, I think, and one you never saw it in any of his westerns. You saw it in his other work. If you ever want to see it, maybe watch How Green Was My Valley. The Walter Pidgeon story is in it, and it's the story of Irish miners, poor Irish miners, and of course Grapes of Wrath. But to be able to do that kind of drama and have this kind of dramatic character is set in against this traditional Western genre, I think is amazing, and not what was expected. And certainly there were other revisionist westerns after that. I think we talked about in my film club, High Noon, which came only a few years later, and clearly was not a western at all. I mean, but set in the West, and so I have just an enormous amount of admiration for this film, and although it may not have been for everybody, I hope some of you enjoyed it as well. And thank you again for listening in. I'm going to do this again Monday night. I'm having so much fun watching these films. It's really just a joy for me, and I hope whoever is interested will continue to watch. The film I'd like to talk about next week is very different. It's a comedy, so we'll have a little bit of some wonderful laughs and everything else. This is a film that was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. It won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay. It stars Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine and Fred McMurray, and it's called The Apartment, directed and written by Billy Wilder. A very small little character-driven film, but really, really wonderful. And if you haven't seen The Apartment, you're in for a real treat. And there's quite a bit to talk about. And of course, there's quite a bit to talk about with Billy Wilder, who, so again, one of my favorite directors and someone who I don't think we've had a chance to talk about before. So thank you all very much for joining me, and I look forward to talking with you all again. Take care.